Co-operative Governance Minister Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma has set November 1st as the date for the local government elections. But an official proclamation will be issued a day after the voter registration weekend. That's on the 18th and 19th of this month. And it all follows an order by the Constitutional Court to set aside the previous proclamation, which set October 27 as the election date. Take a listen.
The issue of whether the political parties will campaign, of course they'll campaign, though there may be some restrictions, obviously, because even when they have a meeting, there may be numbers that are allowed indoors and numbers that are allowed outdoors, the spacing, the masks. So yes, they'll campaign, they can go door to door, but they have to keep to the protocols.
So how practical will election campaigns be under COVID-19 lockdown conditions, and what should inform the easing of restrictions if indeed that is done? Professor Alex Van Den Heever is with the Wits School of Governance. He joins us now via our video link. Prof, it's great to have you with us this morning on the show. Thanks so much for joining us. I mean, it's fair to say these elections going ahead in unprecedented times, that's the one issue, with a whole range of governance and legal issues still in the background.
Yes, so obviously there is uncertainty about whether or not the ANC will have its full candidate list. But I also think that a key issue is really the extent to which campaigning will be permitted without creating the possibility of super spreading events. So campaigning obviously has to happen, but it should still be safe.
Yeah. There are discussions now that the President is holding all kinds of meetings with various organizations, and by all accounts, that communique from GCIS, the government communicator, saying that the President will address the nation soon. I think we can predict that there might be an easing of the lockdown restrictions on the cards.
I think that is definitely on the cards, quite aside from the election. It does look as though the wave is significantly in decline. And it's kind of repeating what we've seen in the previous waves, but also what we saw with last year's winter wave. So we are seeing that trend, and it's potentially a combination of summer plus sort of localized immunity that occurs after a wave of infections. So it does take, then it will stay low for a while. So I think that we are out of the woods at the moment, and we do have to therefore give some priority to the economy at this point.
I mean, if we look at other countries and their holding of elections, that's happened a number of times now over the past 2 years or so, holding the elections under a pandemic. It hasn't boded well for their COVID-19 infection numbers in general.
So if you have to look at a country like India, their electioneering coincided with the emergence of the Delta variant. And that caused severe harm in India. But India was also in a situation to begin earlier vaccinations, and they didn't, because they're one of the world's largest producers of vaccines. So there is an issue of the extent to which they had actually adequately protected themselves, or through caution to the wind with the electioneering. So it does depend very much on how the campaigns are run. But we have to understand that by the time we have the election itself, so that's the voting, a very large number of people will have been vaccinated over and above the number that is vaccinated to date. So I think that we're in a different position to what many other countries would have been when they had their elections.
I mean, the issue of India and beginning their campaigning season, you know, sort of lining up with the emergence of the Delta variant. The Delta variant itself is still of major concern, even for us here. Our vaccine rollout plan has not gone at the speed we would have hoped. I think our latest numbers now puts our number of people who have received at least one shot of a vaccine at just over 14 million. I think that's the latest number from the NICD. But the Delta variant is still a very big issue in the country. We can't compare where we're at now in the pandemic to where we were last year at the same time of the year.
Yeah, not in relation to the sort of the nature of the variant, but what we are seeing is that people who are vaccinated do not develop severe illness to the extent people are unvaccinated. So that is actually quite important. and the numbers are bearing that out, and I expect we will get a lot more numbers soon, but we are seeing some of the indications that the people who have severe illness in high care ICU, in critical care, tend to be people who are unvaccinated, not just tend to be almost exclusively unvaccinated.
Yeah.
So the issue is vaccinations help, and that's in the middle of a Delta-driven wave. So it shows that it does matter, the vaccinations, and it's very important. And by the time we have the elections, we will have another 12 million people vaccinated with at least one shot.
Yeah. You know, in countries like the US, there are now reports around children, younger people, some of them children, getting sick from the Delta variant. That's certainly something that we also need to keep in mind, given that only those 18 and above are eligible for a COVID-19 vaccine. What is the role now of government, you know, as we build up to this election silly season of campaigning and still adhering to, whether you've received your vaccine, still adhering to those non-pharmaceutical interventions?
I think it's going to be very important. The issue is that when restrictions are removed, people tend to say it is okay to take risks. It's actually not okay. It just means that the responsibility for managing the risk falls on the individual. So all the settings do need to be protected still for COVID, even if you've been vaccinated, because you can still be infected and you can still transmit.
Yeah.
So, and we will not be able practically to vaccinate all the people who want to be vaccinated in this period. So there will always be, for quite a while, there's still going to be a relatively large residual unvaccinated population. And we have to protect that population as well while we're in the process of vaccinating.
Yeah.
So vaccinated people can infect them if they develop mild illness,
yeah.
and therefore it's not sufficient merely to say if you're vaccinated, you're safe to behave as you wish.
Yeah, absolutely. The onus really on political parties as they gear up to campaign under COVID-19 regulations to ensure that those non-pharmaceutical interventions are adhered to. Of course, the flip side of the election story is that the DA, for one, has already indicated it's in the process of filing court papers insofar as the reopening of the candidate list process is concerned. It says that the IEC went too far in interpreting the Concord decision and amending the election timetable. Do you reckon any of that is going to play into whether the elections actually go ahead on the 1st of November?
I don't think it will have an impact on whether or not the elections go ahead. I think that they are definitely going to happen. The courts will decide on the sort of technicalities and niceties of that decision. There were quite clearly perceptual problems created by the IEC's decision, given historical decisions they've made, which have been not in the favour of other parties. But that will be determined legally. It is obviously better that everybody has their complete candidates list going into an election, and that is more natural and doesn't create a sort of a sense of unfairness. But I think it's absolutely important that the IEC is always, it acts and is always seen to act impartially in an election. And that's something they have to really pay very careful attention to in this period.
Absolutely. Professor Alex Van Den Heever, as always, a pleasure talking to you. Thanks very much for your time this morning. On the AM report, local government elections, the date has now been announced, November 1st. We're just unpacking all of the various implications of the elections going ahead in the midst of a pandemic.